I came out of anesthesia with a surgical implant I didn't consent to. The hospital says I signed paperwork requesting it. The recovery room nurse was removing my IV when I felt it. A hard ridge under the skin behind my right ear, roughly the size of a dime, raised and tender to the touch. I pressed on it and pain shot through my skull like someone had driven a nail into my brain. The nurse, whose badge read Stephanie Vargas, noticed me wincing and said the implant site would be sore for a few days, but the discomfort should fade within a week. I stared at her, my post-anesthesia fog making it hard to process her words. "What implant?" I asked, my voice coming out thick and confused. She looked at me with mild concern and explained that the neurostimulator they'd installed during my gallbladder surgery was standard procedure for the study I'd enrolled in. She said Dr. Leonard Foster had placed it exactly where I'd requested, that the device would help monitor neural responses during recovery. I told her I hadn't enrolled in any study and definitely hadn't requested any device in my brain. Stephanie's expression shifted from concern to that practiced medical neutrality that meant she'd decided I was being difficult. She said anesthesia sometimes caused temporary confusion and that I should rest while my wife completed the discharge paperwork. Before I could argue further, she'd left the recovery bay and pulled the curtain closed behind her. My wife Rebecca arrived 20 minutes later with a folder of discharge instructions and a prescription for pain medication. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes red from hours of waiting in the surgical area. I immediately told her about the thing in my head, about the implant I hadn't agreed to. Rebecca's face went pale, and she pulled back the hair behind my right ear, her fingers finding the raised bump I'd discovered. "What the hell is this?" she asked, her voice tight with anger. "They said you were just having your gallbladder out. Nobody mentioned putting anything in your head." We found Stephanie and demanded to speak with Dr. Foster immediately. She said he was in surgery, but that the patient coordinator could review my case. A woman named Monica Reyes appeared 15 minutes later with a tablet computer and that same practiced calm. She pulled up what she claimed was my consent form, dated that morning, specifically authorizing the placement of a neural monitoring device as part of a clinical trial for post-surgical pain management. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, shaky and unclear, the kind of handwriting you'd have right after they'd started the sedation. I stared at the screen and felt my reality tilting. I had no memory of signing that form or discussing any clinical trial. "I never agreed to this," I said, my voice rising. "I came here for gallbladder surgery. That's it. Nobody mentioned a study or putting a device in my skull." Monica's expression remained professionally sympathetic as she explained that I'd been offered the opportunity to participate in a research trial during my pre-op consultation. According to her records, I'd expressed enthusiasm about contributing to medical science and had signed all appropriate consent documents. The device was a temporary implant that would be removed during a follow-up procedure in 6 months, she assured me, and I'd be compensated $3,000 for my participation. Rebecca demanded to see Dr. Foster face-to-face, said we weren't leaving until someone explained why I had an unauthorized device in my head. Monica said she'd pass along our concerns, but that all procedures had been properly documented and authorized. She handed Rebecca the discharge folder and suggested we schedule a follow-up appointment to discuss any questions once I'd had time to recover from the anesthesia's effects. Her tone made it clear the conversation was over, that as far as the hospital was concerned, everything had been done correctly, and my protests were just post-surgical confusion. We left feeling like we'd been gaslighted, like our own perception of reality was being dismissed by people who held all the power and documentation. The drive home was tense and silent. Rebecca kept glancing at me, her hands tight on the steering wheel, clearly wanting to say something but not knowing where to start. When we pulled into our driveway, she turned to me and asked if there was any possibility I'd agreed to something, and just couldn't remember. I wanted to be angry at her for even suggesting it, but the doubt in her voice matched the doubt starting to creep into my own mind. Anesthesia did strange things to memory and consciousness. What if I had agreed to something in a moment I couldn't now recall? What if my signature on that form represented a decision I'd made while my inhibitions and rational thought were chemically suppressed? I told Rebecca I was certain I hadn't agreed to any study, but even as I said it, I felt the ground shifting under my certainty. How could I prove what I'd thought or said while drugged? My word against their documentation, and in that equation, the institution would always win. That night, I couldn't sleep despite the pain medication. The implant throbbed behind my ear, a constant reminder that my body had been modified without my genuine consent. I got up around midnight and started researching neural monitoring devices, trying to understand what exactly had been put in my head. Most of the information I found was technical and dense, but certain phrases jumped out. Brain-computer interface, neural data collection, experimental technology. These devices weren't just passive monitors. They actively recorded brain activity, uploaded data to external servers, and in some cases could even influence neural patterns through targeted stimulation. By 3 a.m., I'd found a forum where people discussed their experiences with various medical implants. I created an account and posted a brief description of what had happened, asking if anyone had similar experiences with devices being placed without clear consent. Within an hour, 3 people had responded. One person said their mother had received an implant during heart surgery that she'd never authorized. Another described waking up from a routine procedure with a device they hadn't been told about. The third response chilled me to my core. It was from someone using the name Qley, who said they'd been tracking a pattern of unauthorized implants being placed at certain hospitals. All part of what they claimed was an experimental neural data collection program being run without proper oversight or informed consent. Qley sent me a private message with links to news articles and research papers. The articles described lawsuits against medical technology companies for conducting unauthorized human trials. The research papers, published in obscure journals, discussed the value of neural data collected from surgical patients who didn't know they were being monitored. Apparently, brain activity during recovery from anesthesia provided unique insights into consciousness and cognitive function. But the studies required subjects who weren't aware they were being observed because awareness would alter the very neural patterns being studied. That justification felt like an Orwellian nightmare. The value of my brain data required my ignorance of its collection. Monday morning, I called the hospital's patient advocacy department and filed a formal complaint. The advocate, a man named Thomas Garrett, listened to my story with appropriate concern and promised a thorough review. He said he'd request my complete medical file and documentation of all consent forms I'd signed. Within 2 days, he called back with news that confirmed the hospital's position. According to their records, I'd been fully informed about the clinical trial during my preoperative consultation, had asked several questions about the device and its purpose, and had signed consent forms both for the gallbladder surgery and for the implant placement. Thomas said he'd reviewed the documentation personally, and everything appeared to be in order. He acknowledged that I didn't remember these conversations, but explained that anesthesia-related amnesia was common and didn't invalidate properly documented consent. I asked if I could see video footage from the pre-op area where these conversations allegedly happened. Thomas said the hospital didn't record patient interactions due to privacy concerns. I asked for the names of witnesses who'd been present during my supposed enthusiastic agreement to participate in brain research. He said the consent process had been conducted by Dr. Foster and a study coordinator named Alicia Mendez, both of whom confirmed my willing participation in their statements. Every avenue I tried to pursue hit a wall of documentation and professional testimony that contradicted my own memory and certainty. Rebecca suggested we hire a medical malpractice attorney to at least understand our options. The attorney we consulted, a woman named Rachel Duvall who'd been practicing for 25 years, reviewed the consent forms and gave us a brutally honest assessment. The documents were legally sound, she explained. They specified the nature of the implant, the purpose of the study, the risks involved, and the compensation offered. My signature appeared on every required page, dated and witnessed, even if I genuinely didn't remember signing them. Proving that I'd been coerced or that the consent was invalid would require evidence I didn't have. Duvall said medical malpractice cases involving consent issues were notoriously difficult to win. We'd need expert testimony that the consent process had been inadequate or deceptive, but experts cost money, and our case would essentially be my word against an institution with resources to defend itself indefinitely. She estimated we'd spend $50,000 minimum to take this to trial, with no guarantee of success. The reality was that unless we could prove fraud or find other victims willing to testify, we'd likely lose and be left with massive legal debt on top of having an unwanted device in my head. Rebecca and I sat in Duvall's office feeling crushed by the weight of institutional power. The hospital had all the advantages: documentation, witnesses, resources, legal teams. We had my certainty and my missing memories, neither of which carried any legal weight. I went back to the online forum and reached out to Qley, asking for more specific information about the pattern they'd mentioned. Qley responded with a detailed message explaining they'd been researching unauthorized medical implants for 3 years after their sister had received a similar device during surgery and later developed severe neurological complications. Qley had identified 17 cases across 5 states where patients reported receiving neural implants without clear consent, all involving the same medical technology company called Neurometrics Solutions. The company manufactured experimental brain-computer interfaces and funded research trials at various hospitals. The pattern Qley had documented showed that Neurometrics paid hospitals substantial fees per participant enrolled in their studies, creating financial incentive to recruit patients, even if that recruitment happened when those patients were too sedated to provide genuine informed consent. Qley sent me the contact information for 4 other people who'd filed complaints about unauthorized implants. I spent the next week reaching out to them, documenting their stories, and building a picture of how this operation worked. Each person's experience followed a similar pattern. They'd gone in for routine surgery, signed standard consent forms, been given preoperative sedation, and then at some point during that sedated pre-op period, they'd supposedly agreed to participate in a neural monitoring study. When they woke up with implants they didn't remember requesting, the hospital would show them consent forms with their signatures and testimony from staff confirming their enthusiastic participation. One woman named Patricia Thornton had actually hired a handwriting expert to analyze her signature on the consent forms. The expert confirmed the signature was technically hers, but noted it showed signs of significant motor impairment consistent with being under the influence of sedative medications. Patricia had tried to sue the hospital and Neurometrics, but the case had been dismissed. The judge ruled that the presence of sedative medications during signing didn't automatically invalidate consent if the patient had been deemed capable of understanding what they were signing. Patricia's case had cost her $40,000 in legal fees and left her bankrupt and still carrying an implant she'd never wanted. Another victim, a man named Keith Brower, had suffered complications from his implant that left him with chronic headaches and partial hearing loss. He'd gone through extensive medical evaluations trying to get the device removed early, but Neurometrics had refused, citing the research protocol that required 6 months of data collection. Keith's insurance wouldn't cover the removal as elective surgery, and Neurometrics wouldn't pay for early removal outside the protocol. He was trapped with a device causing him pain because the company that had profited from placing it in him without his genuine consent now refused to take it out. These stories weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic exploitation of vulnerable surgical patients for profit, disguised as medical research. I contacted a journalist named Devin Sawyer, who worked for a regional newspaper and had previously covered medical ethics issues. Devin agreed to meet me at a coffee shop to hear my story. I brought all the documentation I'd gathered, the consent forms from the hospital, the research I'd done on Neurometrics, the contact information for the other victims, and the analysis Qley had provided about the pattern of unauthorized implants. Devin listened carefully, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. When I finished, he said this was exactly the kind of systemic abuse he'd been hoping to expose, but needed more evidence before his editor would approve the story. He wanted medical records, internal hospital documents, or testimony from someone inside the system willing to go on record. Everything I'd shown him was compelling, but circumstantial. The hospitals and Neurometrics would simply repeat their defense that all participants had provided documented consent, and without proof of fraud or coercion, the story would die as he said, she said complaints from disgruntled patients. Devin suggested I try to find someone who worked at the hospital or for Neurometrics who might be willing to talk anonymously about how the recruitment process actually worked. He said whistleblowers were often the key to breaking stories like this. People inside the system who'd seen something that troubled their conscience and were willing to risk their careers to expose it. Finding a whistleblower felt impossible until I received an unexpected email 2 weeks later. The sender's address was clearly a throwaway account created for anonymity. The message was brief. It said the sender was a research coordinator at Memorial Regional Hospital, where I'd had my surgery, and that they had information about the Neurometrics studies that I needed to know. We agreed to meet at a public library in a neighboring town, somewhere neither of us would be recognized. The person who approached me in the library's reference section was a woman in her early 30s who introduced herself as Sophie Lane, though she quickly clarified that wasn't her real name. She worked as a study coordinator at Memorial Regional and had been directly involved in recruiting patients for Neurometrics trials. Sophie explained that she'd become increasingly uncomfortable with the recruitment protocols over the past year, but had felt powerless to stop them. The system worked like this, she said. Neurometrics would identify patients scheduled for certain types of surgery, typically procedures expected to take 2 to 3 hours under general anesthesia. They'd flag patients who met their demographic and health criteria, usually people in their 30s and 40s with no significant neurological history. The study coordinator, in this case Sophie, would approach these patients during the preoperative period after they'd been given sedative medications. At that point, patients were conscious, but significantly impaired, relaxed, and suggestible, often eager to please medical staff. Sophie would present the clinical trial as a valuable contribution to medical science, emphasizing the financial compensation and downplaying the risks. Most patients in that sedated state would agree to participate without fully processing what they were consenting to. Sophie would then have them sign the consent forms, often needing to guide their hands because the sedation affected their motor control. The whole interaction would take maybe 10 minutes, happening in a window where patients were technically conscious, but not in any state to provide genuine informed consent. Sophie said she'd raised concerns with her supervisor about whether this process was ethical, but had been told that as long as patients were conscious and could sign their names, the consent was legally valid. The hospital and Neurometrics had vetted the procedure with their legal teams and determined it met the minimum requirements for informed consent. Sophie had watched dozens of patients go through this process over the past year, and she estimated that maybe 1 in 10 actually remembered the interaction afterward. The rest would wake up confused, sometimes angry, and would be shown their signatures as proof they'd agreed to something they had no memory of requesting. She'd felt increasingly sick about her role in this system, but had student loans and needed the job. Then last month, one of her recruited patients had developed seizures that might be related to the implant. The patient had tried to get the device removed early, but Neurometrics had refused and threatened legal action if the hospital removed it outside the protocol. Sophie had realized she was complicit in harming people and couldn't continue. Sophie pulled out a USB drive and handed it to me. She said it contained internal emails from Neurometrics to the hospital coordinators, explicitly instructing them to approach patients during the sedated pre-op period, because that's when they were most likely to agree to participate. The emails included talking points designed to emphasize benefits while minimizing risks, scripts that study coordinators were told to follow almost word for word. There were also spreadsheets showing how many patients each coordinator had recruited and how much the hospital was being paid per successful enrollment. Memorial Regional had received over $2 million from Neurometrics in the past 18 months, all tied to recruiting patients who were sedated and vulnerable. Sophie said she was risking her career and possibly facing legal consequences for violating her non-disclosure agreement, but she couldn't watch this continue. She asked me to promise that I'd use the information to stop Neurometrics and protect future patients from being exploited the way I and dozens of others had been. I promised her I would do everything in my power to expose what was happening. Sophie left the library quickly, looking over her shoulder like she expected to be followed. I sat there holding the USB drive, understanding that this was the evidence Devin Sawyer needed to break the story. This was proof of systematic consent manipulation for profit. I contacted Devin immediately and arranged to meet him at his newspaper's office. He reviewed the contents of the USB drive with growing excitement, recognizing that this was the smoking gun that would make the story undeniable. The emails alone proved that Neurometrics knew they were approaching patients during sedation, specifically because it made them more likely to consent. That showed intent to exploit vulnerability rather than obtain genuine informed consent. The financial records proved the profit motive behind the recruitment practices. Combined with the testimony of multiple victims and Sophie's willingness to speak as an anonymous source, Devin said he had everything he needed to publish a major investigative piece. He spent the next 2 weeks verifying information, reaching out to the other victims I'd identified, and trying to get comment from Neurometrics and Memorial Regional Hospital. Both organizations declined to comment beyond issuing statements defending their practices and insisting all participants had provided proper consent. Devin's story ran on the front page of the Sunday edition under the headline, "Medical Device Company Accused of Exploiting Sedated Surgical Patients for Profit." The article detailed the pattern of unauthorized implants, quoted multiple victims including me, and featured excerpts from the internal Neurometrics emails showing their deliberate strategy of approaching patients when they were most vulnerable. The story included commentary from medical ethicists who condemned the practice as a violation of fundamental principles of informed consent. The reaction was immediate and intense. Within hours, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. Medical ethics organizations issued statements calling for investigations. The state medical board announced it would review the practices at Memorial Regional and other hospitals involved in Neurometrics studies. Patient advocacy groups demanded that Neurometrics stop all recruitment and remove implants from any participants who requested it. Most importantly, other victims started coming forward. Within a week, over 60 people had contacted Devin saying they'd received unauthorized neural implants during surgery at hospitals across multiple states. The pattern was even larger than Clear Eye had documented, affecting potentially hundreds of patients. A class action lawsuit was filed against Neurometrics and the hospitals that had participated in their studies, alleging systematic violation of informed consent principles and deliberate exploitation of sedated patients. The lawsuit sought compensatory damages for all affected patients, punitive damages to deter future misconduct, and immediate removal of all implants at the company's expense. Neurometrics' stock price collapsed as investors realized the scope of the legal and regulatory consequences the company faced. Their CEO resigned and several board members followed. The hospitals that had participated in the studies, including Memorial Regional, faced their own lawsuits and investigations. Several administrators were placed on leave pending reviews of their roles in the recruitment practices. The Federal Food and Drug Administration launched an investigation into Neurometrics' human trials, focusing on whether the company had deliberately designed its consent protocols to exploit vulnerable patients. Criminal prosecutors in multiple states began examining whether fraud charges were appropriate. The dismantling of Neurometrics' operations happened faster than anyone expected. Within 3 months, the company had filed for bankruptcy, unable to sustain the mounting legal costs and loss of investor confidence. As part of the bankruptcy proceedings, a settlement was reached with the class action plaintiffs. All patients with implants would have them removed at no cost. Each victim would receive $50,000 in compensation. Neurometrics would be dissolved, its assets liquidated, and its executives permanently barred from holding positions in medical research companies. The settlement wasn't perfect justice, but it was real accountability. Memorial Regional Hospital faced its own reckoning. The state medical board found that the hospital had prioritized profit over patient welfare and had failed to ensure that consent procedures met ethical standards. The hospital was fined $2 million and required to implement comprehensive reforms to its informed consent processes. Several administrators who'd known about the problematic recruitment practices were fired, and the hospital's research program was placed under external oversight for 5 years. Dr. Foster, the surgeon who'd placed the implant in my head, had his medical license suspended for 6 months and was required to complete ethics training. Sophie, the whistleblower who'd provided the crucial evidence, resigned from her position, but was protected from legal retaliation by whistleblower statutes. I had my implant removed 4 months after the initial surgery, this time at a different hospital with clear documentation that I genuinely wanted the procedure done. The removal surgery went smoothly, and when I woke up, the only thing in my head was my own brain, the way it should have been all along. The physical scar behind my ear would fade eventually, but the psychological impact of having my bodily autonomy violated would take longer to heal. Rebecca and I used part of the settlement money to pay off the medical bills from both surgeries and put the rest toward our daughter's college funds. We'd talked about what happened almost constantly in the months during the investigation and legal battle, processing the violation and the fight for accountability. Now we rarely mentioned it, having said everything that needed saying. The experience had changed me in ways I was still understanding. I'd learned that institutions would sacrifice individual welfare for profit without hesitation. I'd learned that the systems meant to protect patients could be manipulated and corrupted. I'd learned that fighting back required finding others who'd been similarly harmed and building collective power that individual complaints could never achieve. Most importantly, I'd learned that justice was possible, even against powerful interests, if enough people refused to accept institutional gaslighting and demanded accountability. Devon's continued reporting on the neurometrics scandal earned him a National Journalism Award. He'd moved on to investigating other cases of medical exploitation, using the networks and contacts developed during the implant story. Qley, the anonymous forum user who'd first helped me understand the pattern, revealed themselves to be a data analyst named Linda Okoye, who'd been researching medical device companies since her sister's death from ED implant complications. Linda had compiled the most comprehensive database of adverse events and consent violations in experimental medical trials, making that information publicly available to help other victims identify patterns. Sophie, the whistleblower, found work at a patient advocacy organization, where her experience with medical research protocols made her invaluable in identifying potentially exploitative practices before they harmed patients. The broader impact of the scandal reshaped how medical research was conducted. Multiple states passed laws requiring that informed consent for any experimental procedures be obtained before patients received any sedative medications. The FDA implemented stricter oversight of medical device trials and required independent monitoring of recruitment practices. Medical schools added comprehensive training on consent ethics, using the neurometrics case as an example of how profit motives could corrupt medical practice. None of these changes would undo what had been done to me and hundreds of other victims, but they would protect future patients from similar exploitation. That was worth fighting for, worth the months of stress and uncertainty, worth reliving the violation over and over during depositions and interviews. I'd been marked against my will, both literally with the implant scar and figuratively with knowledge of how little protection patients had against institutional abuse. But that marking had also been transformed into purpose, turned into action that prevented others from experiencing the same violation. 3 years later, I attended a memorial service for Keith Brower, the man whose implant complications had left him with chronic pain and hearing loss. He'd been one of the first people I'd contacted when building the case against neurometrics, and we'd stayed in touch throughout the legal battle. Keith had finally gotten relief from his symptoms after the implant removal, but the years of suffering had taken their toll. He'd developed depression and anxiety, struggled with medical PTSD, and eventually taken his own life. His wife read a statement at the memorial saying Keith had been destroyed, not by the implant itself, but by the betrayal of trust, by the institutional gaslighting that had made him doubt his own mind, by the powerlessness of being trapped with a device he'd never wanted, while the people responsible told him he'd asked for it. Standing at Keith's memorial, I thought about how close I'd come to a similar fate. If Rebecca hadn't believed me, if Sophie hadn't had the courage to come forward, if other victims hadn't been willing to speak out, I could have been slowly destroyed by the same institutional forces that had killed Keith. Justice had come, accountability had been achieved, but it hadn't been fast enough to save him. The final settlement check arrived on what would have been Keith's 50th birthday. I donated a portion to a patient advocacy fund established in his name. The experience had taught me that individual violations were never truly individual. They were symptoms of systemic problems that would continue until enough people demanded change, until institutions faced consequences severe enough to alter their behavior, until the cost of exploitation exceeded the profit it generated. The implant had been removed from my skull years ago, but the mark it left on my understanding of power, consent, and justice remained. I'd learned that bodily autonomy wasn't a given, but something that had to be fought for and protected. I'd learned that documentation could be weaponized to gaslight victims, while institutional resources drowned individual complaints in legal complexity. Most importantly, I'd learned that fighting back was possible, that collective action could overcome institutional power, and that even after profound violation, agency could be reclaimed through demanding accountability and preventing future harm. 4 years after that surgery, I stood in my bathroom looking at the small scar behind my right ear, the only remaining physical evidence of what had been done to me. The scar was barely visible now, faded to a thin silver line that you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. But I knew it was there, knew what it represented, knew how close I'd come to losing myself to institutional gaslighting and exploitation. The device was gone, neurometrics was destroyed, and the people responsible had faced consequences. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was real, and it meant something. That had to be enough, because no amount of legal victory would ever fully erase the violation of waking up to discover someone had put something in my brain without my genuine permission. But at least now, when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who'd fought back and won. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.